I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. A previous guest, Dan Gardner, spoke about forecasting and risk. One of his central points was, as he put it, the things we're doing now are so incredibly complex, to see even a little bit into the future takes an enormous amount of struggle, and even then we're going to make mistakes. As CEO of Newroll, predicting just 12 months out is hard. As we expand, variables and risks multiply. Anything I can do to take risk off the table is helpful. In the past, I've been blind to the risk of FX exposure in our budgeting. A small movement could eat into our investment budget and compromise our credibility when our forecasts are wrong. If you want to remove risk from your foreign exchanges without breaking the bank, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Family businesses face unique governance challenges, balancing tradition with transformation, family interests with commercial priorities, and legacy with long-term sustainability. Few people understand these dynamics better than Peter Clark, board member and shareholder at Clark's, the iconic family shoe business. Peter has been at the heart of Clark's evolution, navigating the complexities of family governance, board composition, and external investment, including the pivotal decision to bring in backing from Lion Rock Capital, which was subsequently transferred to Viva Goods, a company controlled by the Chinese former Olympic athlete Li Ning, who has 6 medals, including 3 golds. Today, we'll explore his experiences in finding the right i-NED fit, managing family dynamics, and steering a family business through significant change. Peter, a huge welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Oliver. It's great to be here. And given this year marks the 200th anniversary of Clark, I think it's a particularly meaningful time to be having this conversation.
Well, that is amazing. 200 years. And we were talking earlier, and you mentioned that you have been through a number of independent non-executive directors in your time for the family board. And I'd love to hear that journey that you've been on, because I think you've been through 7, if that's right.
I should clarify, the 7 is slightly misleading, as we had some shuffling of seats around the Aviva investment, but the point is still very valid. I think if I kind of look back, each i-NED we brought in did bring something to the table. Some were instrumental in helping us professionalize governance. Others brought clarity and expertise around particular issues. And, if I'm candid, a few just weren't the right cultural fit. What the experience has taught me I've been on the board now 8 years, is that especially from the standpoint of a family shareholder, successful i-NEDs need something more than expertise in a family business. They need patience, they need emotional intelligence, and over an appreciation for the complexities that come with a business steeped in history, values, and timelines that stretch across generations. It comes down to a balance, that you have i-NEDs that are willing to contribute confidently without disrupting the dynamics of trust that hold a board together, but they're also able to view everything through a family lens. And I think that's different from what a typical i-NED may need. There are complexities and uniquenesses to family businesses that you have to be aware of.
So that resonates a lot with my own experience of family boards. The way I suppose I've always seen it is that patience and emotional intelligence is a necessary but not sufficient criteria for a board member to have. For them to be really good, they've got to add value as well. But the ones who can add value but who don't have that patience and emotional intelligence will not work.
Yep. I think that's very true. If I think about the i-NEDs where we haven't got things right, in particular, one that comes to mind is a director we brought in who had brilliant domain knowledge and came on board to help us with some of our non-customer facing issues, but couldn't wrap their head around the fact that the family had opinions about how the business should be run. It's not that those opinions were mandate, but they were positions coming from close to 200 years of involvement with the business, and that they deserved to be heard. And I think no matter how good your skill set is, if you don't have that ability, it's a bad fit all around. I think one of our most successful i-NEDs likes to use the phrase that there's never a dull moment at Clark's. I think that's indicative of how different some of the challenges with family owned businesses can be compared to a Fortune 500 business.
So when you're thinking now about picking i-NEDs for your family business, it sounds like finding people who understand the family values, have the patience, who understand the job to be done or the problems and understand the customer. Is there anything else that you think is really critical as you think about the constellation of your i-NEDs that other family chairs of family boards listening to this might find instructive?
It always kind of strikes me as it's the same process as finding the perfect sort of life mate or spouse. It's extremely difficult to do when you're talking, Clark's, our term is 9 years or has been. We've changed it recently, but you're looking at a long-term relationship and there are a lot of factors you will never get right and never understand. And, that said, yeah, I think we've talked about some of the sort of oddities of family businesses, but it goes beyond just dealing with the family ownership for the i-NEDs. The Clarks, we like to talk about employees who bleed green. And that comes from the original color of the Clarks shoe boxes was this very particular shade of green. And, those people are the backbone of the business. Whether they've been there a year or 20 years, there's this very strong sense of family and community. And those people consider themselves part of the Clark's family, and the family considers them part of the family in the same way. And I think you have to make sure that i-NEDs understand that they need to hear the voices of not only the family shareholders, but within the business. And I think also finding i-NEDs who understand the role of long-term stewardship. It's kind of a cliche to say that privately run firms don't follow a Wall Street reporting cadence. But at least at Clark's, that reporting cadence is almost generational. We don't worry about, well, the board does and the CEO does. But the family doesn't necessarily worry about what this week's or this month's sales were. And I think, at times that can conflict with what may be an obvious short-term solution. And I think it can be extremely frustrating for an i-NED who's come out of, exclusively that type of setting to really thrive, because they don't sometimes understand why they're getting pressured to step back and maybe look at this on a longer term, perspective.
So if you're sitting down and meeting with a prospective i-NED, what are the questions you would be asking them, and what are the things that someone can do that would impress you and make you think, you could be someone we want to work with?
I think that's an excellent question. And it partially goes back to my lead-in about this being like picking a spouse. It's quite challenging to necessarily see those values in those conversations. I'll tell you that I think to work well on a family business board, you have to be able to check your ego. If sitting down talking to someone, there's a strong ego, that's going to be a black mark almost immediately. I think having an understanding that family brands and many successful brands that aren't family brands go beyond a product, that there's something else there, and that in talking to someone, you can kind of suss out that they share those values. They're not all about, turning the first quarter profit, that they understand that you need to give something back to a community, that you need to build something bigger than just sales. I think being able to genuinely present yourself, that is where you come from, is probably what would impress me or does impress me most. That you understand that fact and that it's not all about the bottom line. Clearly, performance is critical. Any investor wants to get a reward for investment. I'll have to say, I may have to go away and think about what those questions are, because it's an excellent query.
I imagine those were things that you were looking for when you sat down with those i-NEDs that you got wrong. And I suppose I'm curious to hear what, with the benefit of hindsight, should you have asked or should you have done with them? Was it about spending more time with them, perhaps, that would have allowed you to see the characteristics that meant they were unsuitable ultimately?
It, I think probably this goes to how I've grown as a board member. I've become much more aware of where those challenges need to be made. So, those i-NED recruitments that we got wrong were probably 2 years into my board appointment. And it's being able to say, what is important to you in a business? What do you value? How do you see the role of a family interacting? How do you feel about being asked questions, being challenged when the challenge may not make purely rational short-term sense, that it may be being asked for a longer term perspective. And honestly, I think it's being qualified and challenging candidates on those criteria. I think in retrospect, I've also gotten much better about recognizing the need for board members to listen and for detecting when people aren't good at listening. And again, this comes back to checking your ego at the door.
We're obviously much earlier in our journey as a family business, but one of my takeaways, because, we've made some mistakes with some of our board advisors. And one of the things I've got much better at doing now is to spend a lot more time with them and to get them doing much more sort of what I call job specific tests. So we actually would put them through a couple of board simulations, effectively, or real world board problems, and see how they operate in a group environment. Is there anything like that you think can help? I've heard others do walkarounds. It's less actually, that's not specific to family businesses as such, but they go do walkarounds of the shops, the facilities, whatever it might be. And just by watching how people are interacting with the person at the reception, with the person who's doing the cleaning or whatever it is, you pick up some of those values things that at an interview, someone who's polished will breeze through, but actually the actions speak much louder.
Yeah, I'd have to say we haven't necessarily used that in the selection process, but I think incredibly useful insights come from exactly that. I'll echo exactly what you said. Shop visits really are very revealing about how a person does interact with your staff and with other people. And that is absolutely invaluable feedback. I will store that idea. It's recruiting tool in the future. But I think that is it. You can get away with a fair amount in interviews, but don't reveal how you respond in a boardroom setting or in a value-based business. And those are what are critical when it comes down to it. I don't need someone to bluster on for 45 minutes and not listen and not take into account other viewpoints. And that type of small exercise of taking them to a store does reveal a great deal about who a person is.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was Charles Allen in episode 72 talked about how he took people traveling with them, went on a 10-hour flight with them because he said, everyone breaks. No one can hold up a facade for that long. So you always get to see what's behind the mask, which made me laugh. Now, you're a 7th generation family business, which is a remarkable achievement. What do you think are the key factors that have enabled the organization to endure for such a long time?
My great grandfather, Bancroft Clark, was instrumental in taking Clark's to the next level and building it to an international brand that it is today. He used to say that if you were going to take someone's hard earned wages that they'd spend hours earning to give them a shoe, you better over deliver on what you gave them. You better over deliver on comfort, on quality, and exceed their expectations. And I think that way of thinking has kept Clark's relevant to our consumer. And that idea continues to drive everything we do. Internally, you have to have something beyond a product. From the way I see it, people have to be invested and believe in what you're doing. And for Clark's, the Clark's was founded by Quakers in 1825. And the principles of treating people right, building community, have certainly played a very strong role. And we talked a little earlier about bleeding green. And I think that's a big part of it. It's not just about keeping a family involved. It's about keeping everyone engaged, from our employees to our customers, and having them feel that they're part of something bigger and that there's a purpose behind it. I think probably, I think you asked about the business rather than about the family's involvement in the business and keeping it involved. But I would say that what's been critical to the family remaining involved in Clark's has been that we had a structure like the family council, which we can go into in a moment. Yeah, starting with my father's generation, the family became less and less directly involved in the business. My generation, very few members have worked in the business. And I think that makes it harder and harder to involve people and keep them engaged unless you have some type of mechanism like the family council, which funnels discussion, funnels interest, feeds back information from the business, and keeps people wanting to stay part of Clark's. So I think those would probably be the two key factors that I would identify.
So for someone who's not familiar with the concept of a family council, can you just articulate why that's such a valuable construct?
Sure. So the family council is technically called the Street Trustee Family Council, or the STFC, was set up in 1994 at the time of an outside offer to purchase the Clark's business. And the family needed a way to sort of channel the discussion and the debate around that offer and to speak with a common voice back to the offer. It's made up of 16 members based on 4.5% ownership of the Clark shares. Over the decades, it's continued to serve that role of consolidating and amplifying a single view to feed back to management and to the board. And it's been set up so that the STFC chair and the two family directors provide that bridge between the council and the board. I think, to be honest, it's worked really well to prevent miscommunication and to build trust with the board. I think if we didn't have the council, there'd be voices coming from every direction. So that's kind of how the council has worked.
Have there been moments when the council have made crucial interventions?
Well, I mean, the council's ability to make interventions is somewhat limited. So they speak for 85% of the votes, the members of the council. So they have that ability. The interventions have to flow through that bridge. If I talked about two major points in the history, the one would be rejecting that 1994 offer, and the second would be 2021 accepting the Lion Rock offer. And neither one of those has reached a significant debate and discussion, but both highlight the value of having that council structure in place. I think without having such a group, it would have been far more challenging to get to a decision point. Navigating away to these sorts of existential moments doesn't actually end the crisis in some ways. I guess if we'd voted to sell the business, it might have, but both cases we decided to stay in, and that necessitates having a sort of need for rupture and repair. Without the council, I'm not sure how we would have unified the family again. Everybody would have gone off in their own directions.
Are there particular types of discussions that you dread having in the family council because you know they will be particularly difficult?
I don't know if I dread having them. The discussion around product and shoes can quite often be quite difficult because there are extremely strong opinions. I don't know if you imagine this is how the council works, but at times, people will bring a shoe and go, well, what is this? Why did we make this? I don't understand. And it will go on for hours. So I don't think I dread those conversations, but they can be quite interesting to say the least. I think there are times have been discussions about the future of the business that I don't dread them, but they've been difficult. And, around the 1994 deal and around the 2021 deal, there are a small minority of the family who doesn't necessarily want to stay in the business. So, those discussions are very difficult, but, we've been able to, again, through a great deal of discussion and debate, work through them and maintain a cohesive, consistent viewpoint.
Building a board career takes time. but it doesn't have to take forever. New Role Plus helps accelerate the process with expert advice, personalized guidance, governance training, and access to hundreds more board roles. Go to plus.newrole.com to find out more. For a non-executive and independent listening to this who's involved in a family business, are there things that, in your experience, they can helpfully do vis-a-vis the family council, or is it best that they just stay well away from it and only interact through the chair?
No, I'm glad you asked that, actually. I think we benefited tremendously from having our i-NEDs come and speak to the council occasionally to provide an independent color around how the business is. But perhaps even more crucially, during times of crisis, they've offered a very reassuring voice that's seen as, in some ways, the family directors are too close to it. The CEO is not a independent, reliable source always. And we, as I said, been very lucky to have two independent directors currently who fulfilled that role brilliantly and were able to steady the council and say, this is what you've got to do. We've done this before, stay steady. And so I think that's where they add a great deal of value to the council's operation.
How do you think about balancing that professional decision-making relationship that you have with family members with your familial relationships with them? Have you ever had issues on that front, and what have you learned about what helps on that front?
I think it's interesting. If I look back in history, I think there were perhaps more direct clashes between family members, and the history kind of created division. And perhaps as we've moved out of direct management, that those clashes have become less. Again, I actually would point to the council as being the tool that's allowed us to take family out of business. So, your family baggage gets checked at the door. Well, once you're in those STFC meetings, it's about the business, it's about the brand, it's about how do we perpetuate the heritage and the legacy of Clark's, and what your Aunt Hilda did 15 years ago doesn't matter.
And how critical is it who you have in that room? Is it important that you select the right people from the family to be involved? Do you even have that choice?
Do not have that direct ability. Certainly have the power of persuasion and spend a fair amount of time working with the STFC chair and others to sort of say, okay, as we're looking at the next generation, who do we think might be good to approach or to suggest that maybe they consider joining the council? I think where it's critical is that you're forming the pipeline quite often for who we nominate to be the family board members. Not always, but I would say 85% of the time, the directors have come from the council. So making sure that you're able to find people who have the skill sets and literally the time to be on the board, who can be on the council sort of as a proving ground, absolutely vital. And it's not an easy process at all. I think you asked earlier what recommendations they might have for people setting up family councils. That's one of them, is how do you identify sort of the successes in each generation, and how do you recruit them, and how do you encourage them? Because it will come back to be vitally important.
It's interesting because you as a family have evolved to remove yourself from the executive. What was the thought process there? Because many families stay very heavily involved in the executive side.
I think part of it is just getting to seventh generation. It becomes harder. For 6 generations, there was a more limited pool of people to choose from. As you get further and further out, there wasn't necessarily support for any particular individual to become CEO or board chair at that moment. And I think in some ways, people just developed other interests as well. And it gets back to when you have, I think we have 500 shareholders. I think they're probably closer to 400 family members. People develop different interests. You're not all living in Street Somerset, where Clark's is based. It's a very small, sleepy town in rural Somerset. So I think that's one of the challenges. It was almost self-selecting. People didn't want to work in the business. It was considered difficult at times. It was considered you were relying on nepotism to get your job. And I think part of the humbleness of Quakers may also have come back to play a role in that perhaps we didn't always consider ourselves skilled enough to run a significantly large global business. If you ask me if I thought that was a mistake, I would probably say I do. I think my generation should have been pushed to be involved more in the business.
And for a family board member who's listening to this, struggling with understanding what their role is as a board member, how do you see your role? Is it that sort of related to the stewardship and guarding those values of the organization? Or how do you define it in your head versus, say, the independents?
I think you have every one of the usual responsibilities and obligations as a board member to any business. And then layered on top of that, I think you are the voice of the heritage, of the guardian of Clark's for 200 years and for what principles it represents, and making sure that the business continues to value and to stress those. And, as I said, sometimes those won't necessarily be aligned with a short-term decision, but it's my job and my fellow family member, board member, to espouse those views and to make sure that they have a voice and that they're heard. Clark's, it's been around for 200 years because it stands for something, because there's something behind that brand. And if you walk away from it, it is likely to be extremely detrimental to who we are and what people see us as.
What are the things that you've done that you feel have helped you add more value as a family board member that someone coming into the role new, hasn't got the level of experience you've had, might not yet realize and wish you'd known when you'd started?
I was very fortunate when I joined the board to have an overlap with my outgoing family board member for, I think, about 8 months. Was able through them to develop the relationships within the business that kind of tie back to what we've been talking about, valuing these people who bleed green and believe in the business and developing trust with them. And I think it's quite difficult without that, in some ways, to be authentic and to represent the idea that you do stand for the business and for its heritage and what it's been about. So I think that idea of helping incoming board members, family board members, develop those linkages. And we haven't really talked about it, but being in the business, I think, is absolutely critical for family directors, whether you have majority ownership or not. It gives a face to those values. It provides reassurance to the business, and you learn far more talking to people on the shop floor or in the coffee room than you do any other way.
Now, you've referenced that critical moment in 2021 when the Family Council decided to bring in outside investment. Can you talk us through that decision? What I suppose I'm particularly interested in is what board members listening to this might learn from that if they're involved in a family business facing that situation.
Yeah, I mean, it clearly was an extremely difficult moment for us. And I alluded to the fact that we're faced with kind of the worst possible moment business-wise. I think the family had to ask a very difficult question, and it was, would holding on compromise the business's future? That we spent 200 years building this thing that we all loved and cared very deeply about. That was a very painful discussion because obviously it had financial implications to people. But I think 7 generations, it goes beyond the financial interest. People do care about the company. They care about the employees. They care about the product. They care about the pension fund. They care about everything. And those 200 years of stewardship, I think, made that decision easier. We kind of based it on the same principles that founded the business: responsibility to those stakeholders, responsibility to your community, and long-term thinking. And it was very clear that letting go to some degree was the best decision. It was also very clear that the family had no intention of leaving the business. They wanted to stay very much involved as shareholders, as active owners, and continue that guardian role going forward.
What value did the board play, and particularly the independent directors, in that decision, or was it purely family council led?
No, again, I mean, it kind of, you've got to put it in the frame of this was all happening during the pandemic. So the crisis decision making process we talked about earlier, and which i-NEDs kind of rose to the top, they did the same with the family council. So, they were pivotal in walking the council through options for outside investment. And again, this reassuring voice of, okay, we can get through this, you know, seen something like this before. This is what we need to do. The family directors, again, didn't necessarily have that perspective at that moment. And other i-NEDs didn't step up at that moment. And I think that's a role that a good i-NED can really play in a family business, is again offering this different perspective than myself, who may be too close to things to necessarily step back and see. And it works on the board as well as interaction with the council.
What were you looking for from an investment partner, and why did you end up going with Lion Rock and Li-Ning?
So we really weren't just looking for capital. We were looking for a partner who respected our brand and our heritage. We were committed to a partner who thought in generational holding terms rather than 3 to 5 year exit. And we were looking for someone who was willing to maintain the principles of quality, value, and fairness that had been the cornerstone of Clark since 1825. And, my great grandfather founded the business on. And to be honest, that was a tall order. A lot of the options were private equity, where you knew what was going to happen. It was going to be a 3 to 5 year turnaround. And, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. The family was actively involved in the selection process through the council. Obviously needing to get shareholder approval meant that, anyone interested in investing had to win our favor. And I think that really helped in terms of establishing a relationship with the Lee family very early on. We were able to put a face to the deal. It was a family to family relationship. And we were able to see that their intent was to grow and foster Clark's, not to carve it up and resell it.
And how has the family dynamic evolved now that you're a minority shareholder?
In terms of the Clark's family or the interaction?
The interaction of the family council with the board and the Clark's family.
I would say the family is now 49% owner. And I think it clarified and solidified how the family through the council interacts with the business, and it more directly interacts with Viva and the Lee family as the 51% owners. Previously, we were feeding back to the board and the CEO and some of the impact of our opinions that might have been overlooked or ignored. Going forward, since the Lion Rock investment, that relationship's been significantly clearer and significantly more impactful. They seek out our opinion, we seek out their opinion, feed back and forth on footwear ideas. It's an investor to investor, both intent on making sure that the business does well type of arrangement. Whereas in the past, it was, okay, you have this majority owner who weighs in every once in a while, but isn't necessarily crystally focused on the business. And again, in some ways, it's put even more weight on the family, the Clark family, weighing in on making sure that we preserve the heritage and those values that we stand for.
So if you're sitting now as an independent on the board of another family business who are contemplating bringing in an external majority investor, what are the key bits of counsel you're offering to that family before they go ahead with bringing that investor in?
I think it's understanding what you as a family want as an outcome. I mentioned that the Clark family had no intention of leaving the business and wanted to continue to have a voice. So I think I'd want to understand whether that was their intention as well, whether they were looking for an exit, because I think that that really plays a role in what kind of investment you want. And I've been on other family boards, and I think sometimes people do want to realize their payday and make an exit from a business, and probably would want to exist in a 49 position simply to collect a dividend. And yeah, I'd want to understand whether that's the type of deal that the family wanted, or whether they did want to maintain, yeah, influence and a role going forward, because I think that's critical to who you choose as a partner. As I said, we got very lucky with the Lee family. They've been a joy to work with, but they also fit what we wanted. If the family had wanted an exit, I'm not sure they would have been ideal. Maybe a private equity firm would have given the people a quicker way out. So I think it's understanding what your fundamental goal is for seeking that investment.
Anything else? Any other key considerations? So if understanding what you want is key, what else?
I think, and maybe this is from just personal experience, I'd want to make sure that the family understood what they were doing and was aligned. Because at the end of the day, you are a family, and it will have repercussions if you are not in agreement. So I think that would probably be my second call out.
And how do you go about doing that practically? Because in the face of it, that sounds like an obvious thing to say, but I guess the reality of these things is always more complex. I mean, I've seen that so many times in transactions where people think they want a transaction and then, oh, this actually means things are going to change.
It does. And I would like to say that we figured out the solution to that, but unfortunately not. It's a constant education process. I mean, we absolutely believed, and again, this is with the inclusion of the i-NEDs helping explain the process and the ramifications, that the family understood what was going to happen, what the structure was. But at the end of the day, unless you're kind of living it day in and day out, you don't understand some of the nuances. So, here we are in 2025, 4 years after the deal, and I still find myself having to help people understand how the structure is, where their investment sits, and that type of nuance. So yeah, no easy answer to that.
In a way, it sounds like you need to, as a board member, you need to anticipate there will be, grief is probably quite a good analogy, that there will be the sort of an emotional roller coaster of going through the grieving process, no matter what you do. And so preparing people for that, I guess, might be one thing you can usefully do, which is, we've over-communicated, we've told you what's going to happen, but trust us, this isn't the end of it. This is going to take time to digest.
Yeah. And I would point out, again, it's, 4 years on from a deal, and we're still going through that grief period with some people and that readjustment period. And I think we tried to do a really good job communicating that to the family. And again, I think we dropped the ball in some areas where, perhaps there were things we didn't think about that people would be worried about.
What would be an example of that?
Honestly, it's random things like the employee Christmas party. Will that continue to be paid for? And in the end, it wasn't. As we mentioned, Clark's was founded in Street, Somerset. It's a very small town. Clark's is still a significant presence there, and a fair number of the family members live there. So they sort of have direct interaction with the pensioners, with the current employees. So it's very close to them, and helping them work through that. It came back to even giving them talking points around some of the issues. So, if someone comes up to you in the street and says, what's going on? Is the family leaving? Lion Rock is a Chinese, Hong Kong-based business. So, there would be questions about, are the Chinese taking over? And, these irrational questions that you have to be able to answer. And we did a lot of work in providing those templates. But I think at the end of the day, you're never going to catch every case and every concern.
Peter, time has flown, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to ask you some short questions and ask you for quick responses if you're ready. Best book every board member should read, and why?
I think Essence of Decision by Graham Allison, which is a book about the Cuban Missile Crisis that I read in graduate school, but provides a series of lenses to evaluate every decision. And I've found incredibly useful in looking at how organizations, individuals, and departments make decisions.
What's one boardroom behavior that should be banned?
I think arrogance, and in particular, intellectual arrogance.
What's one board ritual that sounds ridiculous but actually works?
I think I'll draw one from the family council that reflects the family's Quaker roots. And I'm not sure it's transferable to the formal board setting, but that is to reach agreement by consensus rather than vote where possible.
Favorite quote?
I'm not going to get this perfectly right, but it's a quote by Larry Summers, who is the U.S. Treasury Secretary. It's something along the lines of, change often takes much longer to happen than you think, but when it does, it is faster than you possibly imagined.
Most significant professional insight?
I think being right isn't enough. You have to be persuasive.
Worst professional advice you ever received?
Don't make waves.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
I think to be effective, you can't operate from a safe distance. You have to be engaged and to get your hands dirty.
Tell us about a time you were dead wrong in the boardroom. What happened and what did you learn?
Early on in my career, I had a habit of overestimating the power of logic to address trust issues. In a nutshell, you have to be better at reading a room and your EQ has to be higher. There are times when, again, you can see a logical solution and it's not the right answer in that moment.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I think I've embraced that I don't need to know everything. I just need to ask questions that other people aren't asking.
And finally, if you had a billboard in front of every boardroom, what 3 things would it say?
I think this is my favorite question. Act like owners, not advisors. Listen hard, speak carefully, and leave your ego at the door.
Peter, thank you so much for taking the time to share your wisdom and experience.
Absolutely, Ollie. Thank you. It's been a joy. And I would be remiss to say that this is Clark's 200th anniversary this year. And opening up in Street Somerset later this September will be the Shoemakers Museum. So if anyone is interested in Clark's, the family, the shoes, or Somerset, it's an excellent outing.
If you want to accelerate your board journey, New Role Plus gives you the expert support, practical training, and broader access to board opportunities you need. Listeners get 10% off at plus.newrole.com. Apply the code ENTER at checkout.